I am thrilled to be here today with Ruchika, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation about her brand new book that just launched in March, Inclusion on Purpose, which is here. I'm super excited to have it. Um, in addition to being a successful author, Ruchika Tulshyan is also the founder of Candor, an inclusion strategy practice that works with leading organizations to develop strategies that create diverse teams, inclusive cultures, and promote equity for all. A former international business journalist who has lived and worked in 4 countries, Ruchika is also a regular contributor to the New York Times and Harvard Business Review. Um, over the course of the pandemic, I've been reading her articles and like catching her in assorted podcasts. And then last November 2021, I got a chance to talk to her and interact with her on an email. And I just went out on a limb and asked her out to hang out with me. And we got together the night before my birthday. And it was one of those magical outside dinners during the pandemic where you get to actually meet somebody new and connect. And it was just soul nourishing. Her warm response after almost 2 years on a dreary pandemic, it was one of the spotlights and highlights of these last couple years. Ruchika and I got a chance to kind of talk about our own journeys, our families, and she had such great insights on a lot of the topics that I spend time thinking about here, and a lot of the topics that we've been talking here with the Seattle chapter of Women in Global Health. And so I'm just so excited to now bring her here to you all and get to share her and talk in the conversation. And I really want to encourage people to use the chat function. I wish we were all together we were all just sort of holding glasses of wine and chatting and eating snacks afterwards. But one of the benefits of being in a virtual environment is that you get to like actually respond in real time, and you can kind of like, I imagine like little speech bubbles that are above each person's head. So we can use the chat function to like ask questions, have reflections, say plus ones and stuff like that. So please, I want this to be a conversation, and we're going to try to save some time at the very end to answer questions that come up along the way. So with that, I just want to dive in into this conversation and first say to Ruchika, congratulations on the book. Wow, what an amazing achievement. I hear that it's back ordered because it's so in demand. And I'm really glad that I got a copy before the entire world discovered it. So yeah, I'm just going to dive in with some questions for you, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and folks who are dialing in towards the end of your workday. It means the world to me to have you here. I mean, no matter where you're dialing in from, thank you for taking time and spending the next hour, which I hope you will find to be interesting, provocative, insert whatever the right word feels. But I hope you'll find it to be valuable.
Great, great. So what I love about the book, is that you highlight the role and the responsibility of people with privilege that they must play in helping to rectify the systemic inequities. I'm just going straight in, Ruchika.
Mm,
No softball
mm,
questions
mm.
here.
Great.
So I would love it if you could just share kind of what have you learned? What have you learned about like what kinds of tools and approaches can people be using, people with privilege, as they translate? I feel like a lot of people, the people here in this group have it good intent. How do
Mm.
we translate that intent into actual action?
Yeah, great question, Bindiya. And I kind of want to start, as I answer this question, I kind of want to go back a little bit and talk about my own journey. So I was born and brought up in Singapore, and I identify as an Indian Singaporean woman. And what was very clear in me growing up in this true sort of melting pot of East and West, of different cultures and languages and religions, is that there's clearly a hierarchy that exists in terms of who's considered an expert, who's considered valuable, whose decisions matter, whose voice carries. And for myself, as a minority woman and a minority girl, right? So there's that intersection of gender and race. Growing up in this country, which on the one hand, very innovative, very fast growing. I'm sure most people here have either visited or maybe even lived or had some sort of understanding of, sort of what Singapore really means. And so growing up in this country, which really marketed itself as we're very, very forward thinking, what brought us to, and these are the terms used. I know in global health we go back and forth about terms, but this is a country that went third world to first world in a matter of a few generations. Meritocracy is real. What matters is how hard you work. It doesn't matter what your history is. And so I was really fed to this narrative very, very strongly, and I really believed that growing up. And of course there were moments where I was like, but is this really true? I mean, firstly, as an Indian, as a minority woman, I do experience racism, I do experience bias. So there's that. And then on the other hand, there was also growing up in a fairly traditional conservative with a small c Indian family, and sort of being told, there are limits to what a woman's potential is simply based on gender. So I'm like hearing all these mixed messages, trying to find my way in the world. I live in different countries around the world. I moved to the UK, and then I work as a journalist briefly in India, and then in various cities around the United States. And again, this narrative is very seductive, right? Like what matters, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter where you're born, it doesn't matter, all of those things. What matters, and especially in quote unquote more economically developed countries, high income countries, whatever the words we use, what matters again is like how hard you work, and that pull up your by your bootstraps narrative is very seductive. And what became clear to me is, as I worked in different countries around the world, actually, nope, meritocracy is a myth. You could get all the degrees in the world, you could get all the whatever it is, all the experience in the world, but eventually your identities are going to play a big part, an outsized part, based on how you present, based on what the perception of people like you is in the place that you live in and that you work in. And that started unraveling pretty quickly for me. At the same time, as I do work around women of color, as I interviewed women of color for the book, and my approach is, while I center in stories, I don't center in my own story. And I think one of the approaches and one of the reasons why I believe in that, and why I even came to that approach in the work I do, is because I had to take a good, cold, hard look into where I had privilege and where I didn't. And it became clear to me as I sat with that, as I sat with the discomfort, as I sat with but I have good intentions, but I want to do, I want to do good in the world. I want to make change in the world. I've experienced discrimination too. I've experienced racism too. I've experienced bias too. I've been left out of meetings too. I've been talked over in meetings too. And when I started to shift the narrative to, but here are situations where I had advantages, right? Where I was born, the fact that I could graduate college and have a master's degree debt free, the fact that I could graduate, the fact that I had access to college, the fact that I, can speak English the way that I can, the way that I have a certain accent, all of these things gave me advantages, and my voice carried. And as I was able to focus on that, it became clear that the way to do this work, to create a inclusive society and workplace, was not to center in the ways that I had been wronged or experienced discrimination. Certainly use that as a catalyst to understand, to build empathy, but focus on where the privilege and where I had been granted access could give me an opportunity to create room for people who did not have those privileges and advantages. So I know that's a really long-winded way of essentially saying that this work of trying to figure out and identify and really get comfortable with the discomfort of understanding your privilege is really hard and super necessary to make change.
Yeah, I appreciated I appreciated talking to you about this and thinking about my own privilege. I think about our privilege here as women in global health in Seattle, where we have all sorts of different identities, and we also have proximity to the people who are making the funding. We have many of us speak English as our first language. We have many of us were, I was brought up in an academic institution where I know how to operate and talk to epidemiologists. And so I do think there's this owning of that in our work in global health. And as a woman of color in global health myself, I recognize like that my proximity to that power and my advantages and how, thinking about like how do I use that and make sure that I am making space and stepping back as I especially work with women based in our Africa country offices and our Asia country offices. Something that I think about a lot. Do you? I think my favorite thing about your writing is how you intentionally and proudly center women of color. And I am just curious about how you think women of color, that this concept or that term translates in a global context, and how you think leaders in global health can support and elevate the voices of women of color.
Mm. This is such a good question. And actually, one of the reasons why I specifically wrote a chapter on, global women of color and
Mhm.
global DEI. Um, if it were up to me, I'd write a book about this, right? And we can get into a long conversation about publishing and how publishing so white. 91% of books that are published by the major publishing houses are by white authors. 90% of decision makers in publishing houses are white. So there's a lot of white and Western. So there's a lot of like, oh, why would we want to write publish and take a chance in someone writing about other countries? So that's definitely been its own challenge. But one of the reasons why I specifically wrote a chapter in the book focused on global DEI because I truly believe, and I've lived through the fact that DEI inclusion, issues of exclusion and bias and racism are not a uniquely American or Western problem, right? And in one of the way, and in some way, I'm actually glad that we have the language and the tools to talk about it now. And I think one of the ways that actually organizations that I've been asked to come speak to often trip themselves up. And it's back to that defensiveness that I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to make other people uncomfortable. The way that actually shows up is saying, well, over in this country, we don't talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the words women of color, this concept doesn't translate. And here I really look to the work of Isabel Wilkerson, incredible Pulitzer Prize winning African American historian. Her book Caste just changed everything for me. Caste, CASTE, and she specifically made connections between the caste system, not the racial discrimination, racism, but really the caste system that exists here in America against African Americans, Black people who are the ancestors of the formerly enslaved. And she made connections between the discrimination and really the pain and trauma in society that they experience. And she connected that with and juxtaposed that with the way that in India, the caste system that we might be more familiar with when we talk about caste, how that operates against Dalits and other castes that have unfortunately been discriminated against. And then she also talks about how the Holocaust came about and discrimination against Jewish people, and essentially what she did so masterfully is help us see and give word and language and voice to how discrimination exists in very many societies around the world, in every single society in the world. And the reason why I used women of color is because if we look at where women experience the most deepest forms, where people, not even women, people experience the deepest form of discrimination around the world, where we have the greatest opportunity to affect change, is at that intersection of race and gender. Now, that could definitely mean in a homogenous society, that could mean looking at women who have been discriminated because of religion or because of skin color, right? Colorism is a huge issue, something I touch briefly in the book, but there's some amazing resources out there that really look at colorism and how that impacts the experience of people in the workplace. And so what I wanted to do is to say, this is not a uniquely American problem. Even if the words women of color aren't exactly translating, please use this model and apply it to focus on where people in your region or in your country or in your society experience the greatest form of discrimination, because it is in centering those voices that we're going to, again, be able to make the greatest change. I wanted to make one last point about this, and that is in the introduction, I center sort of three facts, right? So the fact number three, actually, the introduction of the book is women at the intersection of race and gender, or race and religion and gender, or caste and gender experience the greatest form of marginalization. So you have to look into that to make change. The second point I really hone in on and where I ground my work is anti-Blackness is global. Anti-Blackness is global and it is pervasive. We just need to look at the statistics of who in a country like South Africa, right, which is demographically largely Black, but we just need to look at the statistics of who has the top 10% income levels in the country versus the bottom 60%, right? And that is very deeply divided by race. That is deeply divided because of anti-Blackness and state-sanctioned apartheid, right, and racism. So anti-Blackness is global. And white supremacy, number one, white supremacy is also global. And I talk about white supremacy as a system, right? I know it's easy to say, well, either I identify as white or I present as white, and my ancestors are white, so that's why I feel very deeply shameful, or I feel like I'm being attacked when, Ruchika, you talk about white supremacy being global. And I really talk about white supremacy not as an individual issue, but really as a system, right? And I have proximity to whiteness. I have benefited from whiteness, kind of what you were talking about with education and knowing how to do the academic speak and know how to present as quote unquote professional, and certainly being a lighter skinned Indian woman. Like there are all these sorts of ways that I have also benefited from white supremacy as a system. So I think these are some of the ways that I ground my work and make sure that at the center of it, even if the word women or the concept women of color doesn't translate, marginalized women who have experienced marginalization because of their identities and that intersection of gender and another identity, that's where solving for that is where you're going to make the biggest change.
I appreciate that. I think it's been helpful for me to read kind of why you've chosen that. And the way I often think about it, or when I'm talking about these issues, is who's furthest from power. And it may be women of color often, but there might be, depending on where you are, when you start to talk about power, people understand that, right? People, whatever, regardless of which identity it is, when you ask universally, who has the most power, and who has the least, or who is the furthest from, who's the furthest from the decision-making power. I think people can start to connect with that. I'd love to hear like a little bit more about you and kind of your experience. And I appreciate that you don't want to center yourself, but so as a Singaporean woman, you've talked about how cultures where loud voices and overconfidence are prized, how that can hamper the careers of women of color. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Actually, there was a study from Stanford, which a couple of years ago really blew my mind and gave voice to the issues that I have seen and so many of us anecdotally talk about. And it's this idea of like, who is confident, who gets to be seen as a leader. Leadership paradigms very much center around whiteness, around maleness, around a very command and control style of leadership. And that's what success looks like. That's who we reward financially. That's who we reward with titles. That's who we give to, I know in the global health field, it might be less to do with money, but who we give the budgets to make the biggest impact, right? And time and time again, those paradigms have harmed women, and especially women of color. And one of the studies, the study that I really think about is a study from Stanford a couple of years ago, which looked at the way that hiring managers made decisions based on interviewees who identified as white American and the way that they presented in an interview, and applicants who identified as Chinese from Hong Kong. And essentially what the study did is it looked at how, how are hiring managers scoring these applicants? What were the things that were, that were coming up as like, this is why we want to hire this person, why we don't want to hire this person. And time and again, even in situations where the Hong Kong Chinese applicants were more qualified, right, in terms of like objective criteria of qualification, they were scored lower because they weren't very effusive and they weren't very quote unquote personable in their interviews, right? And so we've seen this. I have worked with global health teams. One of my clients, it's not a secret, one of my clients is with the Gates Foundation, the malaria team. And time and time again, when I have done assessments around what helps teams hire for global health teams hire for, for really important work, right? Really life-changing work. There is a lot of that. We think this person is going to be a good culture fit here. We think they're going to, bring, I've heard, and this is in various organizations, I've heard things like, I could really see myself having a beer with this person, or I could really see myself, hanging out with this person. And you're like, well, how is that going to make a difference when we're thinking about, solving some of the world's greatest challenges, some of the world's biggest challenges? And so I think these ideas of confidence, these ideas of loud voices, the person who thinks quickly on their feet and sort of is rewarded for that, that we need to own up to the fact that that's the way that our culture operates today. And one of the interesting things is everyone knows this, and without naming it, without actually being able to say, hey, this is a culture where loud voices are rewarded. Hey, this is a culture where people who speak up a lot in meetings. Hey, this is a culture where you have to present a certain way to be successful. And is that the best way? Is that the way that's going to make the biggest change when it comes to vaccine delivery or eradicating, disease that's disproportionately killing children under the age of 5? Or, you know what I mean? Like without naming that, those systems go unchecked.
I'm like thinking in real time and also jumping to my next question. So I'm just going to pause for a second and let that soak in. I love that.
Can I just say
Yes.
something to Mary O'Connor's question when you share this information
Yes.
about men in power? How do they respond? So I'm actually licking my wounds because yesterday I received feedback from 2 women whom I really admire. One is a woman of color, one is a white woman, who shared with me that when I came in to speak at their organization, the white men in power felt very uncomfortable and felt like I wasn't being fair and that I wasn't being, essentially that all of that can be true, but they also felt very alienated. And I do get that pushback now and then. And I think for me, it's a real moment of questioning myself, right? Like, how do we call in people who have power, right? At the end of the day, we have been doing this. Most of the things I'm saying, especially if you identify as a woman of color, most of what I'm saying, you could write this book, right? Like, let's be honest here. You could write this book. The challenge is, how do you call in people in positions of power and also be really honest and truthful about the experience that so many of us have? And what happens when the stakes are as high as the work that all of y'all are doing? Like, what happens when the stakes are so high, right? There have been some huge failures in countries because of a lack of ceding that power, of being able to name that white supremacy was here in action, right? That the decisions were not being made in consideration of the very people who would stand to benefit the most from them, right? And so there have been some really large failures. And And so I guess the answer to my question is, to your question, Mary, is there are some who take it well and they really, really, take time to understand where I'm coming from. And then there are those who really feel defensive. And I feel sad and I feel sorry, because I do believe in the power of calling in folks and building coalition around this work. And I also feel like they need to do the work before we can really have this conversation.
Yes. Yes, and as much as we can spend our time calling people in and relying, there's some phenomenal allies that you've worked with, that I've worked with. We also don't want to spend all of our energy centering their comfort, right? We need to choose those moments strategically, and if we spend our time centering their comfort and making sure they're comfortable, there's a whole lot of work we're not going to actually get to. And in this role of privilege that you have, that we all have, I feel like we need to use some of that privilege and our positioning to make people a little uncomfortable. Otherwise, we're not gonna make the changes that we need anytime soon. So I appreciate that. Thanks for that great question, Mary. And this is a call out to all of you. Most of you I know, and I know where you live. So put a question in the chat. Okay.
I should ask, Bindiya, I should ask people to raise their hand if they're here because you forced them to be.
Yes. Yes. They're all here
Raise your
because
hand raise your hand if you were forced to be here.
formed by me or my mother. I almost invited my parents. That's how excited I am about this conversation, you guys. Okay, so I'm going to read the quote that blew my mind. So when I first read, and I'm sure you probably have had lots of people say this to you, one of the first things that I read by you was an article that you co-authored with the fabulous Jodi Ann Burey, who used to work at Village Reach. Shout out to the Village Reach folks. In the Harvard Business Review, an article that is viewed by more than 1 million people, and one of the top read articles at HBR. And I just have to read my favorite, the quote that blew my mind a bit. The answer to overcoming imposter syndrome is not to fix individuals, but to create an environment that fosters a variety of leadership styles, and in which diverse racial, ethnic, and gender identities are seen as just as professional as the current model, which Opie describes as the current model, which Opie describes as usually Eurocentric, masculine, and heteronormative. So you and Jodi Ann are reshaping the narrative around what we're talking about what the imposter syndrome means. Can you tell us more about what you're, just tell us more about what you want us to know about imposter syndrome?
Well, thank you very much. And Jodi Ann, if she were here, would also say this, that when we talk to our friends and folks in global environments, outside Western environments, most of them say that they have no idea what we're talking about when we say imposter syndrome. It has been co-opted and accelerated, this idea that women inherently lack something to be successful. They inherently lack professionalism and authenticity and confidence and leaning in and negotiating and advocating, and they need to fix that to be successful in professional workplaces and environments. And what Jodi Ann and I found again and again, that a lot of women, especially women of color and especially non-white women in other countries, would say to us, I don't identify with this. I have no idea what this terminology means. And when we explain it, oh, like it's because of it means this, and it means, you feel like a fraud, like you don't belong, like you don't have your abilities are not your own, like it was a fluke. They're like, hang on. And this has happened a few times. They're like, feel like my abilities are like, I got this job because of it's a fluke. Hell no, right? Because I'm not really good enough, I'm not confident enough. Absolutely not. I don't belong. Okay, yes, that. Stop stop there. It's that I don't belong. It's that the way that I show up, if I want to come into work, I remember, for many years, I actually had a nose ring. I took that out more because of the discomfort. But I do remember the first few times when I'd be in like professional environments, there were times where people were a bit like, so did you grow up in India? Like that would be the first question that would come out of people's minds. Of course, let's not get into, all the sorts of things I hear about my name. And it started becoming clear to me that what happens for a lot of women of color who come into the workplace with confidence and with all the skills and all the expertise and all the like, I'm going to do great here, is constantly feeling like you don't belong. And that exacerbates even a bit of whatever that healthy self-doubt might be. That that feeling of like, oh, like this is a new job. I'm excited. I'm nervous. I'm a bit scared. Like, who do I need to ask for advice? And all of those feelings, those very natural human tendencies gets pathologized in women, especially women of color, especially non-white women in the global context. And so for us to, again, reshape the narrative, didn't expect the article to do as well as it did. Really, really proud of how it did. Really proud of the best part, always, always, is hearing from women, again, around the world saying like, this either reshaped the narrative, or for me around imposter syndrome, or I haven't heard the term imposter syndrome, but yes, I have felt like I don't belong, and that helped me. This article helped me reshape it. Those are the best moments, right? The rest of the accolades or whatever. But I think what I hope, and what I hope that, in speaking in circles like this, is we can check each other if we see one of us doing that. If we hear, and I overheard it, I spent time in the technology industry. I overheard a lot of like, oh, like I feel the imposter syndrome. I don't know if I can take on this big project. Again, the problems y'all are solving, they're huge problems. They're scary problems. They're big, hairy, audacious goal problems, right? And so of course there should be some level of like, do I have all the information? Who else do I need to reach out to? Like, it's going to give me those butterflies, those feelings of fear in a healthy way. And do I have folks here who have my back? Do I feel valued and respected and listened to? Do I have psychological safety? And for a lot of women, the answer is no.
Again, want to just, I think that's true. And I appreciate how in your book you talk about what are those measures of like what are the indicators of psychological safety? What are the warning signals when we don't have that? And what can organizations be doing to actually address that? So I'm gonna take us to one more question that I've prepared, and then would love to hear. I'm waiting for the flood of questions from all my people. I'm still waiting, people. And then I'm going to go to Tanya's question after that. So I guess I like how you talk both about what are individual behaviors that people can take on, things that we can do individually, and then also the second half of your book is really about what can organizations be doing. There's super handy like checklists. There's very specific guidance on what we can do to mitigate bias in our hiring practices. And I just flagged that. I think my HR business partners on this call, Daryl, we're going to use those this summer. And I just appreciate that you've been thinking about this with global organizations. I understand you talked to the Gates Foundation and over 350 people showed up. What is your advice to global health organizations on how they can approach DEI, and how they can create more inclusive workspaces with this global lens?
The number one thing is the importance of cultural humility, not cultural competency, but really cultural humility. And cultural competency is saying, I know, I have a cursory understanding of the way that people over there, women of color over there, behave. And it's quirky and it's weird and it's cool and it's kind of whatever it is, it's exotic. And my way is better. I understand how people there, I read a book and I watched these movies, and, I've observed how my colleagues behave. And, I'm competent and I have competency in how their culture operates. But my culture is dominant and my way of doing things is dominant. And again, it's very rare, although I have been in rooms where I've had, where I've overheard bits where I'm like, wow, I couldn't believe someone said that out loud. But most of the time it happens more subtly, right? Like we all know, I'm sure we can all point to, especially if you've been, I know, again, words like on the ground and in the field are controversial, and I'm very glad that they are. But I'm sure all of us can appreciate a time where, hearing someone speaking about their own community, talking passionately about their own community, and, clearly having the expertise to be able to solve some of the big challenges, was met with derision, resistance, like, oh, but they don't have this degree, oh, but they haven't worked in that organization, oh, but they don't have this, and let us, instead bring in this other person with a PhD in a Western sort of organization, let them be the one leading. I'm sure we can all point to an example of that, and that's really cultural competency. We might consider something, they might say, but the people leading and making the decision are over here in dominant culture. And cultural humility is adaptive. It's adaptable, it's adaptive, it's flexible. Cultural competency is fixed. Those people over there behave like this. Cultural humility is let them lead, let their voices be centered. Let them tell us what they need because they know their communities best. Let's work in tandem. In fact, let them lead and let me, I'm okay. I'm more than okay sort of taking a back seat, right? And I think that's something that comes to mind a lot, because I also, for this book, talk to organizations and leaders in various countries who said, like, I work for, so and so large, well-known organization. I am here based in, a part of India or a country in Africa or in, in Latin America. And I am not, I have been told that the way that the HQ operates and their approach to DEI is the way that we're going to do it here, even though the issues don't translate. So I think that being able to have that very global, right, a global mindset for sure, but a very localized approach to DEI is also really necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to some folks who are going to ask you some questions directly, if you're cool with that. Tanya, I'm going to pick on you first.
Thanks, Bindiya. Thanks so much, Ruchika, for just some really inspiring talk. So I just wanted to say that, as Bindiya was talking about her own privileges, it seemed like she was voicing what usually goes on in my mind, but I'm also recognizing my privileges a lot more than kind of seeing, and they're of course in every person's lives, you have fought your own battles that I think one question in my mind is, as women, do we tend to do that more than men? Are men also talking about their privileges to the same extent? And are we taking something away from the equation by being the owners of our privileges more than the other gender? So just kind of bringing that up, because I hear a lot of women recognizing their privileges. So that's one. I would just be curious to hear more about that. The other is just related to that, because I recognize my privileges, I'm also really, I have this desire of wanting to do something, because I've also come from India, so I think I also recognize the extent to which my privileges have played a role in where I am today. And so I've also seen the other side, really, just kind of the whole spectrum, right? In terms of where people who've not had education, but equally capable, have not kind of progressed as much in their life. So you've, in your lived experience, have experienced that. And so I just sometimes wonder, like, what can I do for my colleagues who have not been in similar situations? Like, even at PATH, we have global offices, we have country offices. I work with my colleagues on a day-to-day basis. Are there some concrete ways where I, having recognized my privileges, can do something that can really can address this issue, right? So I think that's what I wanted to kind of, if you have any guidance or advice on that, that'd be great to hear.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for both those really important questions. So the first one, which I think is this is why the work around the intersection of gender and race is something that is very meaningful to me and is the approach that I want to take. And that's because every society in the world is patriarchal, right? And every society in the world, we have not closed the gender gap, whether it's the gender wage gap, whether it's the gender opportunity gap, in any society in the world, even the ones that fashion themselves. And again, there's questions on like what measures can you use and why do they favor Western countries, et cetera, so that you can go down a rabbit hole. But the fact is that if we use even some of the objective measures that the World Bank and other places have come up with, the reality is that we are years, if not centuries, away from closing the global gender gap, right? And so do women, as a result of being disadvantaged, if you present and identify as a woman, do you experience a disproportionate amount of discrimination or being the outsider? Yes, you do, right? You do. And when it comes to recognizing privilege, one of the challenges I have found is when you don't look at that intersection between gender and race, and this is hard. This is hard information, and again, hard for folks, especially for women who identify as white, to hear. But when I interviewed women of color around the world for the book, many times they said the hardest, most painful challenges we've had in the workplace has been at the hands of white women who haven't understood the power and privilege they had in the room. And so in answering your question, do women recognize it more than men? There's no data for this, right? And again, recognizing your privilege, it's a very sort of internal behavioral sort of thing. So it's a little hard to measure for sure. But I would say that anecdotally, what I found is, yes, mostly women of color talk about and recognize their privilege more than white men and white women in general, the discussions that I have seen and I've had. Now, another sort of nuance and layer to add to that is I have also seen it more in industries and organizations where you're shown a lot of models of success for women and people of color, and these are few and far between. You see that in general, more people across the board recognize their privilege, talk about advantages, things like that. And most of the time in organizations where I've seen, I've done, I've studied gender for a while now. I've heard a lot of like, are you going to talk about sharp elbows? Are you going to talk about how women don't help each other? Are you going to write about all of those things? The majority of the time I have seen that be true is in organizations or in institutions and structures where you are shown there's only room for one or two or very few at the top. So you need to have your sharp elbows out. So again, I believe less that women don't help each other out or women don't recognize their privilege or they don't care about others. I don't believe that. What I have seen is the structures, not the individuals, have the biggest part to play in how this plays out, in the workplace setting or in society. And I'm sure, again, if we extrapolate that into how that shows up in more matriarchal societies or how that shows up in more matriarchal workplaces, I'm sure we can come up with sort of our own hypothesis about why that exists. So there's that. On your second question on concrete actions, I have a chapter in the book, and this is not at all saying like go out by the book, blah, 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 but there is a chapter specifically focused on how we can use our privilege to shine the light on people who do not have the same privilege and identities and sort of power, and their voice perhaps doesn't carry in the same way, how we can make room for them and then get the heck out of the way. And I think that's a very subliminal message. No, that is a very important part of this work, right? An important part of this work is if I'm often asked to present in the meeting, or if I'm often asked to recommend someone, or if I'm often asked, I have the CEO's ear, or the chief, development officer, whatever the chief person is in your organization. If I have their ear, if there's someone whom I can connect with because of shared identities and shared affinities, whose name can I speak in that room and recommend for that? Who I have to be really intentional about it. That's the problem. And that's the opportunity and challenge with this work. You have to be very intentional. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it, right? The first few times we're just supposed to be so grateful. We showed up in the room, there was a seat for us, we're so excited. Over time, once you start to develop this mindset around inclusion, what you start to recognize is you won't be able to walk into a room and look around and say, hey, why am I the only, or why is there no one from this country that we're supposed to be, working in? Why is there no one from that country? Why are there not a majority of people from that region or from that country or with this expertise represented? And what can I do to help make that change? I hope that answered your question. I know it was long-winded.
That was amazing. Thank you, Ruchika.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand it off to Ria Kohler.
Hi, Bindiya. Hi, Ruchika. Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I guess so many things resonated with me that you mentioned today. One of the things that that has occurred to me and that has surfaced so many times is the fact that with my position as a scientist and a professor in the School of Medicine, I am invited to the table, right? So I do have that position of privilege. And yet I work with people who struggle with the idea that they want to be in the room, and sometimes they are invited to the room, but they have this perception that it's really their bodies that are wanted because they are people of color and their voices aren't necessarily invited to join the conversation, right? And so there's a little bit of guilt on my part because I do feel that I am invited to voice opinions. How do you do I advise people that that they should remain quiet, and just be grateful that they're in the room? And how do you encourage people to not feel so badly about the position that they think that they're in?
Such a good question. And I remember years ago, Ria, and then I wrote an article on this years ago about, what do you do if you've been called the diversity hire, right? And that's happened to me on my face where, and I'm sure some folks here can have either very overtly been told, oh, you're the diversity hire, or, subtly. And it's really painful and it's really hard. And I think, again, I surmise that's why, whether it's imposter syndrome feelings or whatever, confidence issues, all of these, I think it stems from that. It's overtly, often explicitly, more often, and in many more ways, subtly being told, or you're just here because you're, insert identity here. And I think one of the things that I like to say when I'm asked this question by, women of color specifically, do I belong here? Am I only here because of this? Is I talk about how for the reason why we've been asked to question that and we've been gaslit into asking that question is because nobody asked men when for years, for centuries, nobody asked them, nobody said to them, you're here because you're white and you're here because you're a male, right? Although that was very much the reason. And so I think that's one of the things that I think comes to my mind all the time, right? I always look at the perspective of being overlooked and underestimated as my greatest superpower, right? That is what I bring to the table. I am going to surface ideas that other people who have been overrepresented are not going to see, right? And there's research around this. There's research also from Stanford. I know I'm doing a lot of Stanford talk today, but from Dr. Jamil Zaki, which finds the more privilege you have, you're likely to have less empathy, right? There's an inverse relationship between privilege and empathy. And so I think where I feel like we can really show up for each other is by modeling what it looks like to be quote unquote the other and still have a voice in the room. Like, hey, I have something to say. I have, my perspective really matters. It's passing on the mic, it's especially if you can meet with these folks beforehand and say, hey, I'm gonna call on you in the meeting. Are you comfortable with that? Because I think you have a great idea to share. Once in a while, it might be the surprise tactic of, Ruchika mentioned this really great idea in a meeting I had with her, around on the sidelines, like let's bring this up here. And then amplification. So this was a technique used in the Obama administration, when even in the Obama administration, a lot of women staffers found that their voices, were being sort of overlooked and talked over, and ideas weren't being given credit. And I think how we can all tactically show up for each other is by amplifying each other's voices in meetings, especially in large sort of settings, where you would say, Bindiya, that was a great idea, right? Again, amplify that idea. It was great how you talked about, X. Bindiya, I'm so glad you said that. And here's what I'm going to add to that. So I reinforce that this idea came from my woman of color colleague or, my woman colleague, and then build upon that. And I think some of the interesting things about these norms, these meeting dynamics and norms that I've been focusing on the interventions is it's uncomfortable in the beginning, and then it starts to become the norm at an organization. I've now started working with teams that literally, like, it's the norm to say things like, oh, we don't interrupt people here, or we don't talk over each other here, type of sort of, that becomes the norm. So that's what I like to talk about with, especially around culture and especially around amplifying other people. But, I also want to acknowledge it's really hard. It's very hard when you're the first, the few, the only. When Bindiya was kind enough to invite me to her house, one of the books I gave her was a book called The First, the Few, the Only by Deepa Purushothaman, who is the first and youngest Indian American female partner at Deloitte. And, and really what happens to you, that research around tokenism, when you're the first, the few, the only, the different, and how hyper scrutinized you feel. And I want to validate that exists, and there's power in all of us being able to talk about those experiences too.
Wow, that was amazing. I want to say thank you so much for reminding us about the whole concept of amplification, because it's our responsibility. It is.
Yeah, really is.
Thank you.
It is. Thank you.
I feel like we should just all keep you in our pocket, Ruchika, if that's okay. And we're just gonna, hey, how about this one? Okay, so I'm gonna give my lovely friend Haley the last question. It's gonna be quick because we know we're coming close to time. Go ahead.
All right, so you've mentioned in a variety of venues this experience of coming to the Seattle area and kind of having to navigate this clearly segregated, racially segregated space kind of for almost the first time. And my question is, how have you found yourself navigating these places where people are saying they're doing this work? They're shouting from the rooftop that there are these equity champions and hyper liberal, and clearly there are still obvious inequities.
Such a good question. I just want to center that, especially for folks who, growing up in Singapore, there was a lot of diversity, not necessarily inclusion at all, but certainly diversity where you can live your life not meaningfully interacting with someone who was of a different race and religion as you. And moving to especially Seattle, because before this, I was in New York, I was in Atlanta, I've obviously traveled around a lot of the United States. It was it was really discombobulating to me, there's just no other word. It was very shocking to me to recognize that, the neighborhoods that are good, if you want to raise a child, the neighborhoods with all the resources are overwhelmingly white, right? And in such a liberal bastion, such a liberal part of the country, to me, it was absurd how I would meet people who literally did not have, white people who literally did not have a single friend of color, right? And this is, I mean, research backs this up. 91% of the average white American social network is white. This is PRRI research. And I, you know, in those moments, it's been really hard because, again, I think it's those good intentions. It's, oh, well, at least I vote a certain way, or at least, you know, I believe in these rights and these people's rights and these people's rights. And not recognizing that racism is the biggest issue. I will go on the record. I will say this till the day I die. Racism is the biggest issue of our lifetime. And if we do not solve it, and again, that can look different in different parts of the world, but it is the greatest issue in our lifetime. And when I am around people who say, well, you know, I'm very liberal and I believe in equality, I try to move away from this is who you are, and I ask, what do you do? How do you show? What are you doing, right? I especially take a lot of issue with the word ally as a noun, and I always use it as a verb. I'll say, if you believe you're an ally, okay, tell me what you do to practice allyship, right? Tell me who's in your social network. Tell me what you believe about, you know, people of color. Tell me what you know. Tell me what you believe. And it's not easy, and it's really, really painful, right? And I think so much of the way that this work has been done to date is through naming and shaming and calling out and creating all these really, you know, negative ways to do that. When in actual fact, as I sort of was talking in the beginning, so much of this work is about calling in people. I don't always get it right. When I submitted my manuscript, you know, MIT Press is an academic press, so they needed my work to be peer reviewed. 2 peer reviewers said it's great. All 3 were color. 2 said good book. Let's put this out in the world. The third person said it was harmful, and I had to sit with that. I had to sit with great, really, really honest. I recognize the feedback came from a place of love, but I had to sit with that. I had to sit with the reality that someone said, you know, it's pandering too much white people. I had to, you know, there were some really glaring mistakes and changes that had to be addressed, which I'm really glad I did. And I believe very much that it's a better book for it. But the first time I heard that feedback, I can tell you there was 2 weeks of tears, really nonstop, hard to get out of bed type of tears. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a simple answer, but I definitely think that we all need to investigate in our lives and in our worlds. How do we show up? What are we doing? Not who we are, but what are we doing to advance the causes that we believe we care about?
Thank you, Ruchika. I think you have, I love the concept of allyship as a verb, not a noun. And I am hoping, I think you've now recruited over 60 new fans and
Thank you.
people who want to show up for you too, as you continue to do this work. Thank you for being here. I'm going to hand it off to Chelsea to close us out.